It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Richard Wentworth. He is Advisicon's Senior Project Advisor.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And welcome, everyone, to another edition of Webinar Wednesday. Basically, today we're going to talk about some fundamentals of risk management and then go through some of the processes that are involved in that, and then get into some best practices, talk about some artifacts that are critical and key to use when you're practicing risk management for your operation or projects, whatever the case may be. Getting into some tools. I'd be remiss if I didn't incorporate some of the Microsoft tools that are at your disposal for tracking risk and managing risk. And then basically go into there, I'll show you some screenshots, actually open the tool, and then we can finish up with a summary at the end. Let's get going. All right, so I'd like to first start like I normally do, and I'd like to gauge the audience with a poll question. So how would you rate your current level of understanding of risk management? So are you a novice, an expert, intermediate, or unsure? So we'll see how many experts are in the audience that are going to critique me at the end of this session. But looks like we've got a good mix here. Some intermediates, got an expert in the audience, or several experts there, and some newbies as well. So very good. Okay, so I just want to start basically at a fundamental, and just talk about risk. Okay, so risk is defined. That's the Project Management Body of Knowledge from PMI. And the risk is defined as an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has either a positive or negative effect on a project objective. Now, a lot of people tend to focus on the negative effects, so the negative risks, but it's important to understand that there are also positive risks, and those are known as opportunities. So when factoring your risk management process, you have to make sure that you take note of positive risks, and they could be opportunities, and there's a whole process around identifying those and having strategies around how to deal with positive risks or opportunities. So I like to call that out. I also like to call out the difference between risks and issues. So some people confuse the two, especially if you're on a project and you're reporting and you're maintaining an issue log and a risk log for a project. It's very important to understand that a risk is something that has not yet occurred, and you have a planning process and a whole process around it to deal with it should it occur. An issue is something that basically has occurred. And so again, there's a whole process around dealing with issues. So what I'll do is I want to actually just bring up something that's kind of useful on our side. So we actually have a flow chart here that basically talks about that. So I'll just touch upon this really quickly. So you can see from this is a flow chart that we have here at Advisicon, and it lists sort of a process flow here. The difference between managing issue, managing risk. So, some questions there, and the identify section would be, is this an issue or is this a risk? And it'll take you answer these questions. Basically, is it a live question or a problem? And then if you look at the risk, is this a potential or even condition that could impact the project, schedule, work, or cost in the future? So a series of questions you can ask here, and you can follow this through and see what the procedure would be for managing the risk or managing the issue. So I just wanted to bring that up. Any of you, if you have any interest in these flowcharts, we actually have. You can go to the advisicon.com store, and we actually have these charts available. So if you like this, what you see here, and you'd like to see more of that, feel free to go ahead and visit that URL, and you can actually get one of these flowcharts for yourself. So not a sales tactic, really. Just wanted to make sure that this is a very useful flowchart that we use in our meetings with customers and dealings with them. So and go ahead and offer that to you. So okay. Let me bounce back. Other things I just want to say here quickly is when you go through and look at this, the composition of a risk itself is basically composed of the risk, the impact, and likelihood. So we can have the impact should the risk occur and the likelihood of it occurring. So you can actually build in and make a formula where a risk rating equals impact times likelihood. So that's something useful that you see. That's basically the composition of what the risk is. And, like any of the project management knowledge areas, if you're familiar with all the PMI, PMP knowledge areas, with risk management, Planning is critical to any process. I don't care what the process is, whether it's a professional process, personal process you're trying to develop. Planning is key. So the tactic of making sure you invest significant time in your planning phase of developing a risk management approach, risk management plan, risk management strategy. Make sure you invest the time because it'll pay off dividends later on. So that's that. All right. Next piece. Different types of risk. I won't spend a lot of time on this. There are known risks, unknown risks, and unknowable risks. So the known risks, very easy to recognize. You can probably sit down right away. You're assigned a new project, and you can write those down and know this is going to be a risk to this project. Some of those might be based on lessons learned that you've had, projects maybe done in the past, opinions from experts, or SMEs in your organization. The unknown risk, well, that's the purpose of the risk management process. So this will take you through the following process will actually help you uncover the unknown risks and make sure that you have a process of identifying them, rating them, and then making sure there's a process to monitor them, control them, and then plan the risk responses should they come up. And then you have the unknowable risks. So these are the ones that are impossible to predict. They will come up out of nowhere, and you have to have some sort of process of how you deal with those. So the entire risk management process will give you that, will equip you with the ability to deal with those. And, some of the things that come into play there, you understand, you've probably heard the word contingency. So contingency is a concept I actually touch upon later on, but it's a concept where you actually have funding available that should you have high exposure risks or maybe some of these unknowable risks that rear their ugly head, you have that available to go ahead and deal with those. So, and then, I list these other ones here. There's many different types of risks that are out there. I give this list. I think it's useful when you're going through the risk identification phase that we'll get into, talk about the process next, knowing what the various types of risks are. So I've listed a few there, ones that are very specific to project there on the first row. Then you have things like strategic risks, risks around the strategy you've chosen, operational risks, so things might be operational failures that whether you're dealing with a project or operations, market risks, governance, legal, environment. All these are various types of risks. There's a lot more too: quality risk, competitive risk, all these things. So it's good to have a list of these. Sometimes people struggle when they're starting a new project and you're trying to identify what these risks are. It's good to know the different types of risks that are out there and understand which ones may be applicable to your organization based on the nature of your business or the nature of your project. So it's nice to have a pool of information to choose from when mapping those out. So, okay. In terms of the risk management process, so there is this is the process. Some of you, I pulled this from obviously PMI, basically how I was trained when I got my PMP back in the day, and but some of the people phase 3 and phase 4 there. Sometimes you'll see only the qualitative listed and not the quantitative, but I like to include them all. So. This is a fundamental process of risk management. So like I said, in any planning phase or any major process, you have the planning phase, which is critical. Invest the time in that phase. You have the risk identification. You have qualitative risk assessment, which is basically used to prioritize risks. And that's where you look at the likelihood and impact, basically. So you study you study those elements to get an idea of, okay, what are my serious risks? It gives you the first ability to really look to prioritize risks that you have, that you've noted. Quantitative risk assessment, when that helps to quantify the risk, and I'll go into that a little bit later. Risk response planning, so that's basically how do I respond to my risks? So the various approaches you can take to deal with the risk should they occur. Materialize, and then finally monitoring and controlling. So it's critical to, like the other knowledge areas and processes, monitoring and controlling throughout the entire process of your project is critical, because even though you have risks that may be identified up front, new risks can occur during a project. So it's important to always be monitoring. Maybe risks you previously identified are no longer applicable, so you could phase those out. But other risks that maybe were low have become high. So it's an iterative process, circular process, where you always have to be monitoring. So, All right, so if we talk about each of these a tiny bit, the risk identification, I want to touch upon that. So initial identification of risks, go through as a process we can use. Brainstorming meetings are very useful. They should be cross-functional when you do that, so make sure you have good representation from your various different cross-functional areas of the business, and also include different varying levels of experience with that at the same time. In terms of what is useful during those sessions, I find that using Post-it notes during that. So I'm obviously a big fan of Agile as well. So the Post-it note is a wonderful tool, and when coming up with a brainstorming, that is very useful to have at your disposal. And use those to facilitate the brainstorming meetings. There's other things available to you: lessons learned databases, consulting experts, SMEs in an organization, and then other types of information are available. So very key. And then the other piece of identification is keep identifying. Through the monitoring and controlling process, you may identify new risks. So you're always looking out for ones that may come up and make sure they go through that process. Okay. Qualitative risk assessment, so prioritizing. We go through, and again, we define the risk in terms of severity and impact. We use it as a means to prioritize the risk. The tools that are useful here are risk matrices or risk breakdown structures. So this would be a risk matrix, talks about the probability and impact as you see. Other people call these heat maps. This allows you to see mapping your risks that are low, medium to high, or critical ones. So useful to have these. And then the same thing, while I have this tool up here, there's also risk registers. So if I show you another one, a risk register is another artifact that is used when you're actually logging your risks. So you can see this. This is actually, these give you some screenshots of what this looks like. It gives you identifiers, WBS numbers, risk breakdown structure numbers, a whole variety of fields available. You have the ability to show your probability and impact, which can come up with a fundamental score. And this is a massive template that you can break out and use, but it's very useful. If you're curious, some of these templates, you can go to projectmanagement.com. If you're a PMI member, you can get access to some of these. Very useful to have when identifying your risks, logging them, and profiling them. So, okay, going back to the process, quantitative risk assessment, once we're actually quantifying it, what you're doing here is you're using tools. You can use expert judgment, expected value, benchmarking, interviews, again, expert judgment, simulations. So if any of you have heard of the Monte Carlo simulations, you can use a variety of these tools to quantify the risks. So you use the qualitative first, and then quantitative necessarily follow all of that. So you really use the quantitative to drill down on the ones you've identified during the qualitative assessment, and see which ones are higher profile. Okay, and then the response planning, again, so if you have negative risks or positive risks, like I talked about before, you have a negative risk responses, so you can choose to avoid, transfer, mitigate, or accept risks. And then if you have a positive risk or opportunity, you can choose to exploit, enhance, share, or also accept the risk. So don't have time to really go into a lot of those today, but I want to mention them. And so if you want to go out and do some more research on what those are, feel free. Another thing to do when you're doing your risk response planning is to understand triggers and identifying what trigger events could be. So triggers are those events that cause a risk response to initiate. So you want to make sure you would try and identify what those triggers are, again, using as much information gathering as possible based on what your project entails. The response strategy should be time-bound, and the effort involved should also match the severity of the risk. So that's piece. And then the final piece that I brought up earlier, the contingency. So make sure you have contingency built in. So you do contingency planning. You account for buffers in budget or time in your schedules, just in case the unforeseen, unknowable, unforgivable type events that may come up during your process or during your project. So make sure you do that. go through and talk about some of the artifacts. So I brought up some of these before. So we have the risk matrix or the heat map here. We also have the risk register can be used here at the bottom. There's also a risk report. So the risk reports, not everyone necessarily use those, but when you go through and so you have your project and you actually detail in conjunction with the risk management plan, you also have the risk reports. You can actually detail reports once a project is finished. Pull a lot of the information from your risk management plan, but you actually have to document results to maybe senior executives as a result of a large project. You can use a risk report as well. So I have an example of that as well. And if you want to see templates, we can share some of these templates with you. Okay. Next thing. So we talked about best practices. I want to talk about these actually. So I brought these up. Some of these to some degree, but these are some of the critical ones when you talk about having a successful risk management program. Stakeholder engagement. I mean, I think that's true of just about anything that you do. Whether you're starting any of your projects, you want to have your stakeholders engaged. There's a whole planning process around that as well. So making sure that your stakeholders are aware, they're engaged, they understand that you have a risk program in place and an approach and a process, and the reasons and methodology for following it. That's very important. Management tone. Again, this is one of these things that's sort of very applicable to almost every aspect of the organization. Having the messaging from the top down is critical. So make sure everyone shares the same approach, appreciation for risk management across the organization. Basically from the top to the bottom. If you want to prevent risk, it's critical to have that. I used to do enterprise legal and compliance risk assessments for Fortune 500 companies. One of my previous jobs, and so a lot of companies, it was very important. We talk about a code of conduct and code of ethics from these organizations. If any of you have them, it's important that the tone gets set by management, and having an appropriate risk management program to deal with those aspects that can really put the organization at risk or projects at risk. And very important to have that appreciation. Number 3, communication. As a project manager, I spend the majority of my time, as probably as many of you that are project managers, communicating. In fact, we all probably spend most of our time communicating as part of our position. So communication is key. Making sure the communication is clear. What might seem risky to some people may not seem risky to others. So important you follow the process, you document the reasons why a risk is a certain level, a certain rating, and make sure that everyone understands that, whether it's peers, stakeholders, and customer stakeholders, executive management, whatever the case may be. All right. Clear policies and procedures. So again, this is one of the things I used to audit as a consultant when doing these risk assessments. So having clear policies and procedures, not only about your risk management program, but also the policies and procedures that help to alleviate gaps or issues with risk. So make sure you have a clear, not only a clear documentation of those, but a clear understanding, and that employees know what they are. And then finally, the continuous monitoring. Never stop monitoring. When you go through the whole, you put the time investment of planning everything and mapping everything out, and then you can start your project. You get focused on your project, about the execution, and then you don't do an adequate job of constantly monitoring, evaluating the environment, seeing if the risks that you flagged before are still relevant, or if new ones have arisen as a result of changes to the business, changes to laws, regulations that impact your project, changes to the business environment, whatever the case may be. So constantly monitoring those and making sure that you're communicating, and if that has come up, and updating the documents you have. So updating your risk management plans, updating other types of project documents to account for those risks. So talk about some of the tools with project. I've showed you a couple things in spreadsheets, so you can have matrices and heat maps in Excel. We have also Power BI and Project makes available things. So you can actually maintain a risk register in SharePoint, in the SharePoint list, basically. So if you have projects online and you have a project that gets published, you have your project center, and then you have your project site, you can see you'll have available to you have risks and issues lists available to you. So this is a screenshot here of how you can actually log and maintain the risks in your environment with your schedule and your document library and such. And you can also see that I have a screenshot here as well of when you're entering a new risk. So if you click new item and launch this, it gives you a window that allows you to title the risk owner, who it's assigned to, the status, the category. You can set the probability and impact and cost and description. All these things, you can set up new fields depending on what types of metrics you want to capture. So Project makes it very easy to track and maintain a full risk inventory for your projects. There's also Power BI. So Power BI, so obviously if you're loading data into Project and you want to be able to report on your risks, you'll be able to go in here and clearly provide reports at a portfolio level, at a program level, at a project level, and give those to your executive management. I will go through and actually go into the tool itself and show you how you can play with Power BI. So when you're in here, if any of you have never used Power BI, you hook up all this data basically to Project, and you have this wonderful ability to create these custom reports. These are ones that come out of one of the report packs, but you can see if you toggle on these graphs, it'll actually change the content. So again, if you're reporting on these at a portfolio level or at a project level, you can go through and select all these, and you can filter by departments or types or owners or governance phase, whatever the case may be. All this is completely filterable. So it'll give you an idea of what that is. Here's a portfolio view, and then I can scroll over here and show you a risk and issue report as well. So you can see this type of thing here. So you can actually have the ability to see issues and risks on the same page. So again, here's a matrix, here's a heat map that shows where things are being placed based on nature of probability and impact. So it's more of a bubble diagram versus that block heat map. But a variety of ways you can do this. So I highly recommend that you take advantage of Project Online, and then hook up Office 365 and hook up Power BI to this, and it'll give you a very powerful way of reporting your risks to your organization, to your executive management, whoever your stakeholders would be. And really give it in a very dynamic and highly engaged way for your customers. So, or again, any of our stakeholder. All right. So, in summary, again, going back to the best practices, constantly monitoring. Invest the time in planning and constantly monitor throughout the entire process for your risks. Execute the fundamentals. So make sure you're going through, you follow that process that was mapped out. It's up to you to the level of detail that you want to invest and go into when mapping out, but ensure you go across the various steps in the risk management process, and you'll be in a much better position than if you obviously did not follow that process. Utilize effective tools, whether those tools are templates that are specific to your organization, templates if you want other templates available. Again, you can go to projectmanagement.com. It's a great resource for some of the templates if you're in need of one. Make sure you're utilizing the tools. So you have the tools, you have the ability to use Excel, you can use SharePoint, you can use Power BI and Project. All these are great tools that are available to you from Microsoft to go ahead and support your risk management efforts. And then finally, communicate. So communication's key. It's the foundation of anything. I think all conflict arises out of a failure to communicate. I think something goes like that. That's definitely I've had an experience with that. So communicating, understanding your audience, your stakeholders, and making sure you're all on the same page with the classification of the risk would be key. So with that, I'd love to hand it back to Amanda and see if there's any questions that are out there, and see if we can try and answer those before we wrap up.
Yeah, it looks like we have time for one question. So This one says, how do we deal with unforeseen issues that arise in a project for which there are no corresponding risks?
So again, when you look at unforeseen, so we're talking about the difference between issues and risk in this point. So the question is, are you focusing on the issue or are you focusing on the risk in this case? So if there are no risks that were identified and the issues develop, at that point, you have to it goes down to having a balanced issue management process, just like you have a risk management process. So it was an unknowable risk. You had no idea. And as a result, something has occurred and it's caused an issue at that point. So going back to that flow chart we have, there's a whole process you can follow from managing an issue to, asking questions about a few questions up front, getting to the bottom of, why is this an issue? How is this going to be an issue organization? And doing the same thing, trying to prioritize the issue, understand the impact, and then roll it down the process and vetting it and identifying what it's going to take to resolve the issue.
That's great. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. We welcome your questions and feedback, and for more information, you can email us at contact@advisicon.com. If you're watching this recording on YouTube or another social media platform, please be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future uploads. And on behalf of Advisicon, Richard, and myself, we thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you participate in future webinars. Have a great day, everyone.